All right, guys, Paddle Talk, episode 2. A couple things I want to talk about, are the most obvious materials, the length of the paddle, the ergonomics, how that thing feels in our hand, the orientation, and those kinds of things. Surface area, those types of things are going to give us the power that we need, and the blade shape. And this is going to change, I think, due to water depth and those types of things. So let's just get right into it. And remember, this is R1 raft paddle design today. Everything we're talking about here will be directed directly towards R1 rafting and how that can benefit us here. Rafts paddles are made out of all kinds of things. Your most common one is obviously, your standard Carlisle paddle made out of, ABS plastic. There's an aluminum shaft covered with plastic here, along with, a T-grip also made out of plastic. Carbon paddles are super light, super strong. Carbon's a great material. It's also pretty expensive. It gets pretty expensive on a paddle, a couple $100. R1 rafting, I always worry about losing my paddles. All my paddles are river fines, and so to spend a couple of $100 on something I'm probably going to lose is a hard sell to me. The obvious is wood. Been making paddles out of wood for however long paddles have been being made, forever and ever and ever. Um, Works. Not very, doesn't hold up in the sun. I've had some wooden paddles and other watercraft, and, they are what they are, but they're super cheap. Fiberglass is a great material, easy to work with, easy to make. Uh, Pretty expensive paddle, really. They are lighter than a plastic paddle. Sometimes a little more forgiving. Sometimes they break more. Your very common kayak paddles are definitely made out of fiberglass or carbon these days. Um, our length of our paddles today, for our purposes, I think varies greatly depending on the paddler and the paddle craft that they're paddling from, and also the intended use of the paddle craft. Are we surfing? Are we going downstream? Are we paddling a custom boat? What's going on there? I think determines length for sure. Um, we'll get into that a little bit more. The ergonomics portion of this thing, I think, paddle orientation. Whenever you change hands, whenever you drop your paddle, pick your paddle back up, just knowing exactly where that blade is and what's going to happen. And there's a few things going on there that other companies are doing that I think can be great. Surface area, that's a big one, right? Seems like most of our raft paddles have about the same amount of surface area as every other one. There's a few variations, but all of them have right about, in the area of 100 square inches of surface area here. And not a lot of deviation from that. And I'm just curious about that and how we can maybe change that as more less, as more, as less more. What's the real deal there? And then the blade shape, I think there's a lot going on here, and we can look at other crafts such as C1 canoeing and some of their paddles and the shape of those things, and I think that can bleed over into what we're trying to do here. Also, the kayak paddle design, i.e., the one that would have this kind of a little more curved off, a little bit more up here. You get this kind of shape where you're going in the water at an angle and able to get a little more surface area below the water line. So I think those are the main things that we want to talk about here. I think I'm going to focus the majority of my energy as far as materials go on fiberglass. I'm pretty good with fiberglass. That's pretty easy, pretty cheap material. It can just kind of knock that out. I might do some prototypes out of wood, just because it's also just kind of laying around and easy to chainsaw out and kind of make a rough idea of what's going on. I also have just a stockpile of broken river fines, those kinds of things, to just work with the plastic paddles that we got, with maybe just kind of plastic welding, or even just some prototype type stuff. I'm not going to mess with any carbon, aluminum, any of that kind of stuff at this point until we find the reason to. If we find a reason to, we'll definitely do that. The length of these paddles, in my opinion, and I am definitely no expert, the length of the paddle should be determined by the width of the shoulders of the paddler, where that falls. Also, the paddle craft, whatever you're paddling, the tube diameter should play into this. Like, how far are you from the water? With when you're doing whatever it is you're doing, whether it's going downstream, paddling a big boat, paddling whatever it is, like that distance changes with boat. My mini max, I'm pretty close to the water. I bet I'm not 6 inches out of the water, especially whenever I'm off in the pile and on one side trying to catch that edge or whatever. Not very far out of the water, as it were, where maybe on, a paddle cat, a shredder, something like that, those tubes are huge. And so you're a lot further out of the water. And so a longer paddle would definitely be something that you would need. And I think all of these factors come into play. And I'm going to try to figure out a formula to kind of see if we can figure out where length plays. I've heard get a paddle that comes up to your chin. I've also heard, the bottom of your nose. And that's how long of a paddle you need. But I think that's hooey. Most paddles, you go to a raft shop, excuse me, just grab a paddle. It's going to be 60 inches, pretty much guaranteed. And that's fine. That's a do-all. We can kind of get it done. Most of us work with it and, just piss with the dick we got and make it happen. And that's fine and dandy. But I think when we're talking about R1 boating, every little bit counts. And I think that even small changes to our paddle can make a big difference in what we got going on here. And I think length of the paddle is the easiest thing to change, the most direct thing to change, and probably the one that's going to have the most impact on the outcome of it. The ergonomics of the thing, I think, come into a lot of personal preference. Some of the things I like, this is my paddle here, and I don't know why I like this kind of curved one. It doesn't even really fit my hands anymore. I'm not sure why I gravitate towards this paddle, but it does fit. And, something that fits your hand is great. Now, something that I've seen Sawyer do is they take the shaft, they kind of make this thing trapezoidal shape. That's pretty extreme, kind of what I'm showing, but it gives you a very definite where the paddle is in both hands. So you've got, this hand here, and then this one, you just know exactly where the paddle is. And also you've got a hold of it, so whatever it's going round tends to slip around kind of in our hands and can be a thing. And so I think that working with some of that, along with a good solid handle here, and handles come in all shapes and sizes. This one is actually probably a little better. I can actually get a hold of that thing. It's not such a tight curve there, but they come in all shapes and sizes. We'll get one like this. I don't really like this thing, but a lot of wood paddles are shaped like this. I think it's a real easy shape to achieve. I don't feel like I've got a hold of it. I don't feel like I can hold it by just the T-grip. I don't like it. But you may like it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The surface area, I think, is a huge one. And I think where we put the surface area could make a big difference. And let's talk a little bit about that. So this is our basic, this is the shape of my paddle. This is your basic Carlisle paddle shape. And, let's just talk about how we could potentially improve on some of this stuff. And so I think whenever I'm paddling, what I notice is you can even see here that I have worn this corner off of the paddle, pushing off of rocks and reaching out for that dig, and there not be a very much water there. And you know, when we're creeking, sometimes that's the thing. And so I just wonder what would happen if I should have drew this the other way. For my preference, you know, if we were to take and say, let's just hack off some of this guy right here. Oh, that's not gonna come off. Hack off some of this, let's get rid of that. And then what if we even took that and we just kind of put it up here? That's pretty extreme, but now we have kind of, you know, that kayak paddle shape. I don't really have anything to wipe this off with. So, you know, we get rid of this, you know, and we add this guy right here. That's kind of extreme. We're just kind of replacing this to this. And now what we've ended up with is a directional paddle. So it really matters how we're holding the paddle in our hand. If we were to drop our paddle, if we were to change hands, now you would have a protrusion on one side and an indent on the other, which would be great when you're reaching out and there's not very much water there, because if this paddle's going in at an angle, what we'll actually have is more surface area beneath the surface than what we would have if the paddle were just square edged, which is kind of what we got, which is the exact idea with the kayak paddle. When it goes in, you're going in at this angle and you just want as much surface area as you can get there. Same thing with oars. You know, when you start talking about fishing oars, so your standard oars are long and skinny, your fishing oars are short and kind of fat, and that gets you a little bit more purchase, kind of a lot more purchase in shallower water, where, you know, where the fish are hiding. And so this is what I'm kind of feeding off of. Needs while I'm boating and seeing what's going on the river and other disciplines. Kayaking is the one that we're trying to mimic, and I think that, you know, they have a lot of technology in their paddles, and a lot of this stuff right here comes into play with what they're doing. You know, they're carbon, they're fiberglass, they're super light, the length happens in centimeters. You know, the shapes are all there. There's several different surface areas and a few different blade shapes. So I think we're all on the same path. We just got to figure out, you know, what transfers over to R1 paddling, where we're using one single blade with one person in a lot different type of boat. These are just thoughts of mine. I'm trying to hear what everybody has to say and, you know, kind of feed off of this type of stuff. Surface area is something that I'm curious about. I haven't played with a lot of paddles with different surface area, and I think there's a fine line between having too much and not enough, right? And so, like, a blade with less surface area is going to be fast and streamlined through the water. You're going to be able to power those paddle strokes and get maybe more in, and that may be better than getting one super strong one. So, you know, you've got these, I think it's called the Nomad, right? That looks like it's a great big old thing. It kind of does, that's probably real extreme, but looks like a pizza spatula. It's a great big old thing. And I think that's a lot. I think it's too much. I think you can get hung up in currents with a paddle that big. And frankly, I'm not strong enough to heave something with that much surface area. And I don't know that we need more surface area than the paddle that we have, or if we just want to try to do more with it, you know, because the other thing is, when we're talking about blade shape, is some of these companies out there, you know, they're putting scoops in, and so you'll have a dish to your paddle, which also makes it directional. Kayak paddles also have this dish, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. Though I think it can be beneficial, and I think it can play against us when we're talking about feathering the paddle, which is something that I think we all do, and it's very hard to talk about. It's something that happens supernatural to a lot of us, and we don't even know we're doing it. And I think it makes a big difference in what's going on. And I think as we start dishing these paddles, the currents are going to start doing things with our paddle that maybe be maybe be the opposite of what we want to happen, maybe not, but something we'll find out along the way. Some of them also have a dish this way, where you're kind of getting a shovel shape to the bottom of it, and I'm curious about that. I've never paddled with one of these. I'm curious about it. Another paddle shape that I'm pretty curious about is, I really wish I had something to wipe all this off with, is there's one in the C1 canoe world that is shaped a little more kind of like, I'm not a very good artist, but it gets this thing right here kind of going on where it's kind of bulbous here at the bottom. Kind of capitalizing, I think, on that shallow water, where if you're only able to get half of your paddle in, you still got a significant amount of surface area down here. I don't know how this bump would really work. And, again, I've never used a paddle like this, and this is something I plan on maybe trying. I'm really digging this shape, and I think with a little bit of scooping action, maybe a little bit of dish here, and even some this way where it's really like kind of like a spoon. Maybe that's something we build on. I don't know. That's what this is all about. I'm just curious. But doing my research, when you Google R1 raft paddle design, there's raft paddles, there's just raft paddles that show up. There's nothing for R1. But whenever you look at C1 canoeing, like, they do have a fair amount of technology wrapped up in their paddle design, but there's a little bit of this blade shape design change. Most of them are your standard shape and your standard amount of surface area, and made out of different things. Wood seems to be the high class, for the canoers, along with the carbon race stuff. We're not going to focus a lot on materials right now at this point. I'm curious about just getting more out of our paddles, and so looks a little smaller whenever you do it like that, doesn't it? I'm curious about, if we were to kind of hack a little bit off of here and then maybe just bloop, put that up there and see what would happen. But then I'm also really curious about adding a little bit here, but a little bit of shape, just a little bit. And I can even add, maybe take some fiberglass and just kind of add onto this here and get a little bit. I could probably do a little bit of plastic welding also. I don't know. I don't know, I'm curious. The suggestion was made to me by David about, potentially forging this stuff out. And I think that could work really well for an idea, but I would be worried about, digging that into a rock and it just breaking right off on account of making it any thinner than what it is. Yeah, I'm curious. Thoughts, ideas, right on.